Hey everyone, I'm Nick Raboy from MongoDB, and in this tutorial we're going to see how to get a near real-time single view into your data. So what exactly does that mean? Well, in a lot of circumstances when you're working with your applications and your database or even your data, that data might exist in different data sources. So imagine you're an organization, you have your core instance of MongoDB and a lot of your data might reside in it, but then you've got vendors and those vendors use their own databases and you consume that data through APIs, through maybe S3, maybe some other method. So it could be tricky to work with in a lot of scenarios. But with MongoDB, you can actually use what's called data federation. And with data federation, you're able to kind of aggregate each of those data sources into a federated virtual database and interact with it exactly how you would interact with any other MongoDB database. So you can use queries, you can use aggregation pipelines, you can do all of that great stuff without having to worry about where is my data located. So in this particular tutorial, we're gonna get a glimpse into this. We're gonna be using a few different tools and technologies to get the job done. So for example, you will need to have a MongoDB Atlas account. You will need to have, for this example, an AWS account because we're gonna have a data source on AWS. And then some tooling which we'll use for JavaScript. So we're actually going to use a JavaScript tool called mGenerate.js, which I'll get into soon, for generating some fake data to play around with. But if you have all of that, you should be good. And this should be a pretty helpful tutorial for anything that has to do with multiple data sources. So up on my screen, you'll notice that I do have MongoDB Atlas, so the MongoDB Atlas dashboard. I do have a cluster deployed. My cluster in this case is a free tiered cluster, which is perfectly acceptable for this particular tutorial. But we're going to ignore Atlas for now because we're going to focus on our kind of third-party data first. So what we can do is we can stroll on over to the AWS Marketplace. For this example, I'm going to be using this Carvana car sales data for the United States. So this is a sample data set which we'll be able to use when it comes to combining different data sources. So inside of your AWS account, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to continue to subscribe to this data and add it to an Amazon S3 bucket. I'm not going to walk through those steps as far as adding this data source to an Amazon AWS S3 bucket, but when you're done, it should look something like this. Now, you might notice that my bucket is public. You can choose to keep this as a public bucket, so that way you can access the CSV file as part of an API or an HTTP request, or you can choose to leave it under S3. It could be private, and we can still connect to it perfectly fine using MongoDB. So this data does include data that looks like the following. So if I scroll down, it will include information such as vehicle ID, the year, the make, the model, what it was sold for, things like that. And the whole goal that we're going to be establishing in this particular tutorial is we want to be able to run queries based on customer information and vehicle information. So the vehicle information will come from Carvana, but obviously this data set, as you can see here, does not include information about the customer. So we're going to be generating that data and we're going to bring the two together. Now let's stroll on over to MongoDB Atlas once again. So this is where we're going to add the AWS data set into MongoDB so that way we can interact with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Data Federation. Remember, this is ignoring the fact that we do have a cluster deployed because we're actually using a different part or a different feature of MongoDB. So within the Data Federation tab, I'm going to click on Create Federated Database. And I'm going to have the opportunity to add various data sources. One of them is going to be AWS, and the other, when we get there, is going to be MongoDB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Add Data Sources. In this example, I'm going to be using HTTPS because I've gone ahead and made my bucket public. But if yours is not, you can go ahead and set up AWS IAM rules and configure it this way as well. So I'm going to click on HTTPS. I'm going to give my data store a name. So I'm just going to call this one Carvana. Now it's going to ask me for a URL. So I can get that URL from my bucket. So I'm going to go back into my S3 bucket tab and I'm going to click on the CSV link. And I'm going to choose to get the object URL because once again, it is public. So I'm going to take that URL. I'm going to head back into my federated databases instance tab, and I'm going to add that URL. And I'm going to click Next. So you'll see that it was added to the list when it comes to our HTTPS store for Carvana. I can add numerous HTTPS stores. I can give them different names. I can even add multiple URLs to the same store. It's totally up to you and how your data might be organized. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename the virtual database. It's because virtual database 0 is not particularly helpful. So I'm going to call this one Carvana. And it really doesn't have any relationship to the actual HTTPS store name. This is just how I'm going to interact with it when it comes to querying or aggregation pipelines, etc. So Carvana. I'm going to click Done. For the collection, so this is my Carvana sales data or transaction data based on the CSV fields that we know we have based on what was listed in the AWS Marketplace. So we can call this something along the lines of sales or transactions. I'm going to rename it, and I'm actually going to call it sales. I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to click Done. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag our URL into the dataset area. And now you can see that the sales collection, our virtual collection, has one data source in it. Now we can have numerous data sources for a single collection because in MongoDB, the structure of your data, it doesn't have to be consistent for any given collection. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be consistent, but you know what, your scenarios might be different depending. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Save. Now I could have gone ahead and I could have renamed this federated database instance. Doesn't really matter too much for now, but I do have some data federation set up. So let's go ahead and connect to it. I'm going to say connect. I'm going to choose to connect using MongoDB Compass. So I'm going to get my URL. I'm going to copy it. If you don't already have MongoDB Compass, it is a free tool for exploring your data. I highly recommend it, although you could also connect through any of the MongoDB drivers as well, or some of the other utilities that MongoDB offers too. So I copied the URL. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up MongoDB Compass. I'm going to paste in that information as a new connection. I'm going to provide a username and password, so one that I've already set up behind the scenes when it comes to MongoDB Atlas. I've just called it YouTube for now, and we're going to choose to connect. All right, so I've connected to our federated database, and you can see that I do have a virtual database called Carvana, which matches accurately to what we had just created. If I expand upon it, I now have a collection or a virtual collection called Sales. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it. So this is the data in MongoDB. Now the data that we received from AWS, it was a CSV. You can always open up that URL directly and you will notice that we have CSV data with a header. What happened when we added it to MongoDB as a federated data source is it used the header information to convert things into fields, and each row of that CSV became a document. Now if I wanted to, I could easily query that data. So for example, let's go ahead and query based on the year. I'm going to enter in a query here. And for this one, I'm going to say the year has to be maybe 2012. And I'm going to click Find. So you'll notice that I queried this external data source. This is not part of MongoDB outside of the fact that we've created a federated database. I've used the MongoDB Query API to interact with this data, which is a very powerful tool. Now we're not done yet because the goal of this tutorial was to show you how to create a near real-time view using multiple data sources. So maybe, like I said, maybe you've got customer information, maybe you've got sales information, maybe you've got other vendor information, maybe all this information needs to be brought into the same place for reporting purposes. Perfectly acceptable use case and probably pretty common as well. So let's go ahead and worry about creating a MongoDB Atlas database and collection, so data that actually exists within MongoDB. So this is where a tool like mgenerate.js is going to be helpful because honestly this is sample data. This isn't part of a real customer story. I'm making it up as I go, with the exception that the Carvana data is actually provided from Amazon as a sample data set. Now looking at this data, just so that way we have an idea of what we're going to be working with, we know the vehicle ID. The vehicle ID is probably going to be unique for every vehicle. It doesn't represent a transaction ID. It just represents a vehicle. So we can track its history throughout wherever it gets sold to various customers. It's going to be unique. And using that unique information, we can kind of use a relationship between, hey, this is how we're going to relate the vehicle to a particular customer or a particular customer to a vehicle, because everything else should be pretty dynamic and probably not unique at all. So let's take that into consideration. So if I go over to my web browser now, I do want to show you what the mGenerate.js looks like. So this is an npm package, meaning you will have to have Node.js installed on your computer to download it. There are plenty of other tools available for creating fake data. In a realistic scenario, if you've got your own data, it won't need to be fake. But if you just want to play around with things, this is perfectly fine. So I highly recommend it. So let's go into a code editor now. You'll notice that I already have this code editor populated. We didn't need to type it in from scratch, but I will explain what is happening so that way we get an idea of the type of data that it's going to generate. So first of all, we're going to create a unique MongoDB object ID for every document based on this fake data. We're going to provide it a made-up name. We're going to provide it a made-up address. We're going to restrict it to various cities. So we're going to restrict it because it's going to be easier to work with for this example when it comes to reporting, although your example will probably be much more diverse than mine in the end. And we're going to restrict it to one state, being California. As far as the payment preference, this could be a common item for a particular customer. How did they pay for the vehicle? Maybe we have credit card, maybe we have some kind of blockchain currency, banking, cash, just things to choose from. The transaction history is really probably the most important part of this data generation outside of all the other possible fields that might exist for a particular customer. The transaction history, these are actual IDs for vehicle IDs inside of our AWS data. So the idea here is that we're going to choose from real IDs, but we're going to make it kind of random for each made-up customer. So of the made-up customers, any customer will have anywhere from 1 to 3 different transactions for a vehicle. So we're going to keep it pretty kind of diverse when it comes to our example. We're also going to make sure that it is unique, so that way customers in this example, they can't share the same ID, which may or may not be how you want to use it, but it's going to be good for demo purposes. So you can either save this as a file and run it as a file, or copy it into a terminal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save it and I'm going to run it from a file because it'll be easier for me, but it's totally up to you. So in this case, I've named mine generate_data.sh, so I'm going to run it. Just make sure that you have execute permissions if you are running it as a file. And I'm going to output the results to a particular file on my desktop. I'm just going to call it mydata.json. And I'm going to open up that mydata.json file so that way we get an idea of what it looks like. So this is what it looks like. Each line is going to represent a new document, or in this case, a new customer. But we do have a lot of unique information here, or at least unique enough to make this example work out. And like I said, each customer or each person has 1 to 3 different vehicles in their list. So let's go ahead and make use of that. Let's go back into MongoDB. So we're going to go into MongoDB Atlas. I'm going to close this screen. We're going to take a break from the data federation side of things for now. I'm going to go into data services, and I'm going to click on browse collections, but we're not going to do all of our work here. We're actually going to use Compass once again. We're going to create a database. We can call it Carvana again. It doesn't really matter. And then we're going to have maybe a customers collection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on connect for examples, and I'm going to get my connection string for this particular cluster. And I'm going to go into MongoDB Compass. Now I'm going to close this particular Compass tab for now. I'm going to do a new connection. And I'm going to connect to examples. I don't have a database yet, or I might. It's totally up to you, but I'm going to click on the plus symbol. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Carvana. And for the collection name, I'm going to say customers. And I'm going to say create database. For the data, I'm going to say add data, and I'm going to add it from a JSON. All right, so I've selected my data.json. It is of type JSON, and I'm going to click import. I only have 50 records, so it shouldn't take that long. But when it's done, it'll look something like this. So this is a lot more attractive to look at versus that file that I had showed you earlier, or even the mgenerate script. But the mgenerate script did create this. So if I expand some of these fields, I have some location information fixed to the particular cities that I've chosen, or fixed to the payment preference. The transaction history is what's important to us because that's how we're going to be joining our two collections together, our federated collection for AWS, as well as what exists within MongoDB. So this will give you an idea. There are only 50 records once again. All right, so now that we have this data in there, let's go ahead and bring it into our federated database, because remember, our federated database only has our external data source for now. So I'm going to go back into my web browser. I'm going to close this little window, and I'm going to go to Data Federation. I'm going to say configuration for this one federated database instance that we have, and I'm going to add a new data source. This time around, my data source is MongoDB Atlas, so an Atlas cluster, and I'm going to choose examples, and I'm going to choose Carvana. I can choose either one collection from Carvana, or I can choose the whole database. I'm just going to choose the whole database for this example, and I'm going to click Next. And you can see that we have a cluster store called examples. I can also filter it based on what we have for HTTP or any other particular data source that I might have. So I'm going to go back to Atlas cluster. And in this case, it's not sales data that I have. It doesn't make sense for me to add it to the sales virtual collection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another collection. Once again, I'm going to call it customers. The names don't have to match. It's just whatever makes the most sense. And I'm going to say create. And I'm going to drag it into customers. And I'm going to hit save. All right, so if I connect back to my federated database once more in Compass, and I expand Carvana, hey, look at that. I have two different collections in here now. So I have the sales data, which once again is coming from AWS. So this is an external data source. And then if I click on customers, I also have data from the MongoDB Atlas database and collection. So two different data sources coming into the same federated instance. So I can work with that data exactly how I would any other piece of data in MongoDB. I can use the MongoDB query API or aggregation pipeline or aggregation framework. And we're going to do just that because we're going to work towards creating our own view, so that way any analyst can come in and look at things at a glance in near real time, because as data is updated in our external data source, or as data is updated within our MongoDB Atlas database and collection, things will be reflected almost instantly inside of our view. Or in this case, even if we wanted to view it this way, it'd still be pretty fast as well. So let's go ahead and head on over to the aggregation pipeline builder. So we're selecting the customers collection within our federated database. I'm going to go to aggregations. You don't have to use the builder if you feel comfortable writing your own aggregation pipelines, but this does make things a lot easier, in my opinion. I'm going to add a stage. So the first stage is, well, we want to join these two collections together. So I'm going to say this is going to be a lookup for the from collection. So where's the data coming from? It's going to come from sales. The local field inside of the customers collection is going to be transaction history, because that's what we've called it. The foreign field, which is going to be inside of our AWS data, is going to be called vehicle ID, because that's how it was given to us. And the result of this data, so the result of this join, let's just go ahead and call it transaction history again. So essentially what we're doing here is we're exchanging the ID with the actual expanded data. And here's a sample. So it will provide us with 10 sample documents based on this stage of the pipeline. And I can expand the transaction history, which is still an array. But this time it is an array of objects, and that data is the AWS data. So this is the Carvana transaction data rather than just the vehicle IDs. So pretty cool so far. We maybe don't want to work with the array, or maybe we want to do an aggregation. So maybe our end goal here is to see, well, how many vehicles of a particular type were sold in a particular city. So for example, how many Toyotas were sold in Tracy? Because then any analyst can come along when it comes to this customer or sales data, can come along and say, you know what, this particular city, Toyotas are pretty popular in this city. We maybe want to load them up with more. Or you can use this data however you want, but it does provide you some pretty good examples. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to add stage, and this stage is going to be an unwind. So I am basically going to flatten that array. So all I want is the path. The path is going to be the transaction history. Once again, you're going to be provided with samples. Now we have just flat data, so that array was however many items were in that array, it's now flat, so they exist as separate result entities now. I'm going to keep going down the line. This time around, I want to do a group because now I want to actually do that aggregation of our data to come up with a calculation. So this is going to be a group. For the ID, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, the fields are going to be based on the city and the vehicle type. So let's go ahead and make that an object. So we're going to say city, and it's going to be location dot city, and then the vehicle. So we're going to say vehicle, and we can say something along the lines of transaction history dot make. And for our accumulator, let's go ahead and call this one maybe total transactions. And this is going to be the sum of whatever the group stage has calculated for us. So I can just say sum1, and it will generate a sum for us. So we have total transactions 1. Some of them have 2, some of them probably have more. It really depends on what our random data had calculated. But if I expand the ID, it tells us, well, what city was this? What vehicle type was this? Maybe it looks like Palo Alto doesn't have many sales at all. You never know. This is fake data. It's not too meaningful, but the example still stands. Let's go ahead and say that we want to figure out, maybe we want to flatten this out. Maybe we don't want the ID to be an object. Let's go ahead and add another stage. And let's go ahead and say that we want this to be a project. And we can specify how our final result looks. So we can say maybe along the lines of ID. Maybe we don't want to provide the ID in this circumstance. We have the city. The city could be the ID.city. The vehicle could be the ID.vehicle. And then finally we have total transactions. And as a result, it looks a little different now. It's a little easier to read. So this is pretty good data. And you can run this aggregation. You can even export it to text if you want, so you can work with it in text format rather than stages. And you can also export it to a language. So this is just shell, but maybe we want to export it to Python, so that way we can add it to our Python applications. We could. Maybe we want to add it to C# or one of the other drivers. That's totally acceptable as well. You just copy this code, paste it into your application, and you're good to go. You can even include the driver syntax as well, depending on the language. So we're not done yet. So it probably, our analyst, if we're working with an analyst, they probably don't want to write aggregations nonstop. They probably don't want to write application code. Instead, we want to give them a view. So that way they can just launch Compass or whatever reporting tool that they plan to use. So that way they can get everything at a glance and make their lives a lot easier. So here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to click on the text formatted option here. I'm going to copy it. And there's numerous ways to do this. I'm going to use the way that I like as far as getting this done. But we're going to create a view. And depending on your account privilege, you can create one here. But if you're using an privileged account, you probably will end up with an error because your account may not be able to create views from here. We're just going to go directly into the Atlas dashboard just to play it safe because we want to know our options. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go into a code editor. I'm going to clean it up a bit because we can't just paste it in as is because as is JavaScript format. So we want to make it into actual JSON format for the approach that we're going to use. So I'm going to clean it up real quick by adding quotes around certain fields. I'm also going to remove trailing commas. as well as the comments, and that should make it good to go. All right, so it should be cleaned up. If I missed a comma or something went wrong, it will tell us. So I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go into my web browser now, and I'm going to go into configuration for data federation. And when it comes to our Carvana, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a view. Remember, our view was based on the customers collection, so I'm going to go ahead and click Add View for Customers. This is going to be maybe transaction information, so I'm going to call it transaction information. You can name the view whatever makes the most sense to you. I'm going to paste in that pipeline, and I'm going to say create, and I'm going to save it. So assuming everything went good, we don't have any errors here, so I'm going to go back into Compass. I'm going to expand my Carvana collection once more. You'll notice now I have a new item. So this is our view. So this is transaction information. And if I click it, you can see this is strictly just the output that we saw from our aggregation pipeline. And we didn't have to write our aggregation pipeline this time around. We can even change it. Maybe we find it easier to look at in a table format. Maybe we want to create some charts out of it. We can do various things with this data. And this is really good for kind of at a glance for your customer information if this is your use case. So just want to go over a few things on what we did here just to wrap up. But our end goal was to deliver a near real-time single view into your data. And in this case, this was customer data. And we did that with a federated database. So we took data that was available to us on AWS. So we loaded it into AWS S3. We took data that was in MongoDB Atlas. So a MongoDB Atlas database and collection. And we added both of this into a federated database. Now, we had to generate our own data for our MongoDB data because the basis of this example was based on the S3 data, so we had to generate fake data using mgenerate.js. But in a realistic scenario, you probably won't need to do that because you have real data. But once that was here, we were able to interact with that data, whether it be in S3 or local in our Atlas database. We were able to interact with it using the query API and aggregation framework. And on top of that, we were able to create these views. So these views that now our analysts or report writers, they won't need to write every time they want to look at this data. So you can get an at a glance here. So this is a single view based on multiple data sources. So it's really neat stuff and really powerful. Now, if you enjoyed this tutorial, it would mean a lot to me if you went into YouTube, gave it that thumbs up, and then subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you have any questions regarding this tutorial, drop a comment in the YouTube comments. I do take a look at them, and I'd be happy to assist you. Or you can head on over to the MongoDB community forums and see how other people might be using MongoDB Data Federation as well. Until next time, everyone, have a great rest of your day.